So at the time of recording this video, I just released my new track Protagonist. It's kind of like a neurofunk dance floor kind of drum and bass tune. And I just wanted to do a little breakdown. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to kind of go through the track from a writing standpoint, from sound design, and talk about the drums maybe separately. And I'll put some timestamps in the description and make the chapters and stuff so you can navigate to the parts where you're most interested in, if you prefer. So without further ado, let's just get into this. And I want to start by talking about the writing of the tune. So this tune originally started as a remix, or rather a VIP, I guess, a variation in production. So that would be a remix of one of your own tunes. Because way back I wrote this weird tune in like 7/4, and it was drum and bass, and I really liked the melody in it, because 7/4 is just a fun time signature, I think. And I was listening to that one day, and I decided, like, hey, this melody is actually, I could chop this up and like put a delay on it, and that would sound pretty cool, I think. So that's kind of like where the ball started rolling. So then we get into this section, which is really the first thing that I wrote. So let's take a listen to that. Yeah, and then that leads into the build-up and then into the drop. So let's break that down here. It starts with this little melody thing with a bunch of delay on it. Let me turn off the sidechain, that's gonna get kind of annoying. So a bunch of delay on the last two notes. And then it starts going into all of these bass sounds. So the first thing, it has this really crunchy, or rather, this one isn't actually crunchy, but there's a variation of this sound in the drop that's pretty crunchy. But it's a pretty standard like FM patch, just a little small bass womp. And then it goes into one of my favorite sounds in this tune, which is this really piercing bass, which sounds like this. And then later on, I think I might even automate some stuff to make it even more piercing, like, yeah, it gets even more intense. So the idea with this one was just to make something that has like this very well-defined, really high note that really, you know, it's really hard to tread in that borderline between making something that's too piercing and making something that's kind of too dull, because you want to have that impact, but you don't want to cause ear fatigue and just make something that's just annoying to listen to. I think I'm pretty happy with the balance I striked, and I suppose that's also a bit subjective. And yeah, and then it just goes into some bass stabs. I made tutorials about bass stabs before, so card in the top right corner, and you'll see that. And yeah, then it just kind of keeps doing that thing with some variations. So, you know, it has another instance of that melody. One thing to point out there is that I also think the drums have a really nice interaction with this. So I think this is a really cool way to introduce the drums. I never really do it like this. But I just kind of use the drums to emphasize the riff. Or at least to emphasize the melody at the start there. And then, you know, at the same time, I have some like string chords that play. So you get these really powerful high energy moments here where there's like drums, there's chords playing, there's a melody, and then the stuff with the bass is a bit more mellowed out, leaves a bit more space, and then it goes back into the melody with drums and chords and everything, and then that way it just kind of has this like nice back and forth, introduces some of the sounds and some of the musical ideas, I think. And yeah, that's how it started. And then for the longest time, I had no clue what to do with this. This was also, at this time, when I first wrote this, I also didn't even have these chords yet. And that ended up being a big game changer for me. Like adding the chords, adding some harmony to the tune really helped me to sort of understand where I could take the tune. Because once I had that in place, the little sketch that I had for the drop really started to come alive. So let's get into the drop now. So what we have here is fairly standard like dance floor drum and bass drums, you know, pretty powerful kick and snare combo with other stuff going on around it. It's like some nice little ghost snares there, all that good stuff. One thing that I really like about dance floor drum and bass is that the kicks tend to have a lot of low mids to them, which just gives them this really epic sound, I feel. You also hear some of like noisiest tunes have like these kicks where, 100 to 200 hertz and the kick is so well defined and so punchy. So that's just something I really like for this style. And yeah, and then it's just taking this riff further. And then rather than having the chords with the strings here, I go into this. I'll get into the sound design of this later, but these are like some just nice sparkly sounds. In general, in this tune, I've used a fair amount of sparkly sounds because these chords are pretty sparkly. Then the strings are also sound pretty sparkly. I think I used a bunch of grain delay on those to make them sound super sparkly. And then there's also in the effects, there's like some wind chime sounds I use occasionally. And I don't know, I just really like those sparkly sounds. It gives it this sort of magical feeling, and it's a really nice contrast against like the really hard bass sounds, I think. Because that's essentially what's going on here. It's just, it's the same idea of having this initial melody thing with the delay on it, or actually I removed the delay for the drop because that would just get totally unmixable, and then just like going in really hard with the bass and stuff. So it sounds maybe a bit different without the sidechaining, but you get the idea. I just want to point out this Reese. I'll get more into this later, but this is to illustrate that Vital has been really clicking for me. There's hardly any post-processing on this. I mean, there's like some EQ and stuff. I mean, it looks more than this because all this stuff is fairly subtle. That's how it sounds straight out of the synth. So to illustrate that Vital has been really working for me, it just clicked for me in a way, and I was able to pull these really nice, in my opinion, sounds out of the synth without needing a ton of post-processing like I usually do. But yeah, it just goes on, does the standard thing, introduces some more bass sounds here for the transition. This is like generally a nice bass sample that I made once. It sounds better when it's like now it's reversed, and it sounds better when it's not reversed. But for the transition, it made sense to reverse it, I think. And in context, I think it sounds fine. Another thing is that there's a bit of a back and forth between the melody and one of the bass sounds, I think. Oh, that's actually a secondary melody. Yeah, it's a secondary melody kind of thing. And then there is, I think it's this bass sound. Yeah, so this bass sound usually kind of coincides with this secondary melody, and together they kind of have this back and forth with the main melody. So you got like do do do, and then the bass is just there to kind of fill in some space there, make it sound a little bit fuller. So that's generally the theme. It's this back and forth between this melody, a secondary melody with a bass, and then the spaces in between get filled up by other basses. So then we dive into the B section. You can also see that these chords here, by the way, they have been delayed. So you get this sort of, first it plays the melody for half a bar, and then we drop into the bass sounds with the chords, which I think is a really nice effect. It's like this thing just splashes in, and I don't know, I really like that effect. But then for the B section of the drop, it made more sense to just have the chords start on the one of all the beats. And yeah, I introduced some new sounds. So I introduced this arpeggio, I think. Just a simple little background thing, but it kind of gives the tune a little more drive. It's also like, I feel like with B sections of drops, you kind of run the risk of kind of like making it sound boring for the listener, because you know you have this stuff, and then if you do something similar here, then it's like, yeah, you know, we've heard this, so there isn't really. You need to find a way to keep the energy going, basically, and there's like tons of ways to do this. You know, you can add some layers to your drums. You know, usually something like a ride cymbal on every quarter note really adds a lot of drive. But here I found this arpeggio actually worked quite well. It sits nicely up there. It adds, you know, another sparkly texture amidst terror of this really slimy Reese. And then I have some more really nice bass steps. These are just some samples I made in a tutorial, actually, and I just processed them a little bit. And they're quite... I really like them. They pack quite a lot of punch compared to some of the other bass sounds. Like, a lot of bass sounds just kind of come in with a sub and that's that, but these actually kind of punch you in the face with sub. So it gives it a little bit of a dynamic feel on the low end as well. More dynamic than you would just get from kick and bass. Yeah, and then here's this nice little idea I had where, let's just play it. Yeah, so the structure there kind of changes from, like this main melody thing isn't really used all that much anymore. But I did want to have this arpeggio being emphasized here, and I emphasize it in a couple ways. So I add this, I use some automation to bring that in, make it a bit louder. And then I add this really crunchy bass sound underneath to really add some power and punch to that. Yeah, and then it just kind of keeps doing its thing. It's all pretty similar, just variations of the same stuff. And then here at the end, we finally end off the drop with this the Slimy Reese, and then we put a huge reverb on it to kind of, I don't know, it sounds cool. And then for the breakdown, I like the immediate section after the drop. I feel like it's always nice to kind of treat it as sort of kind of a stripped back drop, in the sense that there's still, you know, a fairly full drum pattern, but you're also not going all out on the bass anymore. You know, this is like where DJs would start to transition into other tunes, and this is where, you know, as a listening experience, you're kind of like, ah, yeah, that was nice, but it's not over yet. It kind of keeps the ball rolling, but it doesn't have the high energy of the drop anymore. And then here, this riff is actually fairly similar to what I had here initially. Yeah, the drum pattern has also changed slightly. I think I moved the snare to right before the 4, so it kind of gives this... oh, excuse me, that's the kick. But yeah, I changed to the snare pattern. Yeah, the snare is like an 8th note after the 4 now, so it has like this nice boom-ka, 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 you know, that kind of stuff. Just a little variation in the drum set made sense to me, fit the riff, I think. And it's also just a different vibe generally from the drop, so it helps set it apart a bit. And then at the end here, let's see how it transitions into the proper breakdown where there's no drums and stuff. Yeah, so we end with some drums and this melody one last time, but the drums do permanently end, and there's this extra Reese to kind of, I don't know, I just made it and it just made sense to put it there like this. Yeah, and then I start to introduce some of these sounds here. So these sounds are like some vocal chops, and here's another soundscape. And these are things I all took from the intro. So if we jump over there to the intro real quick, you can see that that's pretty much what's going on. It's like I start with the strings that we talked about before. And I start to fade in a soundscape, and I add some vocal chops and stuff to make things a little interesting. And then after 16 bars, I start to introduce drums. Kind of a chill almond break. And then I end up layering in another drum break to kind of get us up to the full tempo, basically. And then I transition into the main drums. So with these elements from the intro, these lend themselves greatly to be used in this section of the tune, because this is like a part of the breakdown where I don't want to have any drums. I feel like a lot of tunes are structured this way. You know, it's like 32 bars of drop, then 16 bars of breakdown with drums, and then 16 bars of breakdown without drums, and then 16 bars of breakdown / build-up with drums, more drop, yada, yada, yada. So this is kind of the part designated to not have any drums and be kind of chill in that sense. So these elements from the intro are just so great to use for that, because the intro is already kind of ambient in a sense. It's not exactly ambient, but it doesn't have powerful drums and bass sounds flying around and stuff. So it's a nice mellow vibe. And it's also just nice to kind of reuse elements in different sections like this, because that just gives the tune a sense of coherence. Like you just hear the same things in a slightly different context, and that keeps it fresh, but also makes it not be too different that it sounds kind of alien. Yeah, so then start fading in the soundscape, do the vocal thing. Eventually, we need to get back to the drop, and before that, we need to have a build-up. For this tune, rather than doing a fairly traditional build-up, I actually had this crazy idea at 3 a.m. where I was like, what would happen if I just resample a bunch of sounds from the first drop, and I just start chopping them up and I make it sound really glitchy and just kind of deconstructed in a way. I really like when music does that, when it's totally deconstructed and it sounds like, you know, big Roman ruins, you know, where you can see this once was a building or this once was a tune, but now it's not there anymore. But you can still see some elements and you can still see what it's supposed to be, but it's just completely torn apart and mangled. And that's really cool. I really enjoy that. So I decided to give a shot at that, and it actually ended up becoming my favorite section of the tune pretty much. So let's play it out so you kind of get a feel for what it sounds like. Yeah, and then it goes into the second drop. That bass sound there sounded wrong. I think I got the pitch bend bug again, because Ableton still hasn't fixed that. Yeah, that's what it's supposed to sound like. Anyway, there's a ton of cool things going on here, or things that I think are cool. So if you look at these drums, for instance, you know, we start out... Oh, whoops. Where are we? Yeah, so we start out... even before we get to this section, we kind of fake this build-up, where we use a drum fill that we used before, like right before the first drop. But then we, you know, what I do is I just kind of repeat this bit really fast, you know, to kind of give it that glitchy feel. And also there's like this riser sound, which is another riser that I made, but I resampled and time stretched it, so it kind of sounds like... I don't know, it just has a glitchier feel when you time stretch things, I feel. So we go into that, and we can pretty quickly see how the drums start to deteriorate. Like, on the surface, this is a kick and this is a snare. On the surface, this looks like a, you know, fairly standard drum and bass pattern here, but you can see that it's been stretched out kind of. So like you have the kick on the 1, the snare on the 2, and you would expect another snare on the 4, but it's actually a whole beat late. And this kick is also kind of in a weird spot. So it just kind of gives it this feeling of like, something's going wrong, you know, something's being messed up. And then I just like bang out some snares and do some kick rolls. That's mostly to support the riff, I feel. So if we go into what's going on there, it's just a bunch of stuff resampled from the drop. So it's like this melody thing that we had, right? Turn off the sidechaining again. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure this is like, I just duplicated a section over, I time stretched or something like that to kind of get this feel of like, oh, we're getting stuck on these notes. And that's also a pretty good clue to listeners, I feel like, that we're not actually in the drop, you know, we're not actually supposed to dance yet. But something's going on. Yeah, so then for this next thing here, you kind of have the notes of the melody on quarter notes, like do 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 do. And there's some kicks to support them, but one interesting thing to note is like this kick is ever so slightly off. In fact, it's on the 32nd note grid, and I find that in practice I never really use 32nd notes. Like if I'll do variations for my drums, you know, I'll put a kick or something a 16th note late or a 16th note early, but never 32nd notes, because I feel like often that just sounds like it just sounds wrong, you know. It doesn't sound like it's on the grid anymore. It sounds like it's heavily swung or something like that, or just straight up played wrong or whatever, even though the drums are not technically played, but you know, you get what I mean. And that's also nice because then these kicks line up with these melody bits, but every other one does not quite line up. It's just slightly off. You know, because if they would have been on, they would have been here, and then that would just sound just slightly too straightforward, you know. Normally that would be fine, I think, but considering that I'm going for a really glitchy, deconstructed kind of feel, it just made more sense to do this. Yeah, I just have a nice little shuffle there, totally random, doesn't make sense to be there, because usually the shuffle is kind of like in between the snares and stuff, but now it's totally taken out of context, which I really like. I'm actually not sure what these hits are. Yeah. I'm really not sure where I got those from. Looks like it's something I just kind of transposed down. Yeah, and I interrupt things with the Reese again to reintroduce some bass. Phasers always sound cool. And then here I have this, I really wanted this, you know, this main melody note. I wanted it to basically sound way more intense, kind of more saturated and with a big reverb on it, so you have this big impression. So that's exactly what I did. I have this whole rack that I turn on with like a bunch of EQ and saturation and compression, and then I think I also automate in a reverb. Yeah, I can see that. So it sounds like... So then in context... Yeah, and then I use the drums there to kind of justify bringing in another bass sound. Yeah, and then it's pretty straightforward from there. Here, actually, the sidechaining unintentionally caused sort of a stuttering effect because I bring in the kicks, you know, and I start to fade them in. And also, like, I have a low pass on them that slowly opens up over time. But the sidechain is MIDI triggered, so it doesn't take into account that the kick is super quiet at the beginning here. So it just creates this stuttering effect, basically. So yeah, if you listen to the reverb tail there, it was just a straightforward reverb tail, and then as soon as we get to this point where the kicks start, it starts to kind of stutter rhythmically. But I think that's a cool effect, and it adds to the glitchiness. And coincidentally, it's also nice for mixing because it's already sidechain, or it's you know, it also serves the sidechaining purpose. Yeah, so then we get into the second drop, and yeah, this one was kind of difficult for me. I think I had like 2 iterations. I had like 2 different project files at some point where I explored like 2 different ideas for the second drop. And I was kind of like breaking my head over, oh, you know, this doesn't work, but the other one doesn't quite work either, but I don't know what to do. And, you know, I had these 2 project files, and what I ended up doing is I ended up rendering versions of the tune from both of those project files. And I just started to chop them up in sections of 16 bars. So then I could experiment with, for example, putting the first drop in the place of the second drop, so I could kind of sound like, okay, what does it sound like to come from this really glitchy thing after we've already had the first drop, to then just copy paste the first drop? What does that sound like? Does it work? You know, yada, yada, yada. I also had like some stuff sketched out for a breakdown maybe, and I wanted to know, you know, this breakdown could also maybe work as a drop. And in the end, what I ended up doing is I ended up combining both the project files again, because I found that both ideas were useful, and I could manage to structure them in such a way that it made sense to me. So yeah, let's just get into the second drop. Second drop is a bit of a different feeling. So if we go into all the synths group. So that's sort of the main idea that I had that I really liked, is this chord synth thing going up. Yeah, the Supersaw here. And then it like bounces off of the main melody kind of, because the main melody is always like a bit earlier than the chord, so it sounds like... This is really nice back and forth. And then for this last note, I end up pitch bending it up and adding an auto pan to kind of just like get that kind of feel again. Let's turn off the sidechain again. Yeah, so it's basically just built around this thing. You know, this section is in order to kind of introduce some bass sounds and then prepare us for and then you can see that I wanted to do another one of those, building, you know, one of these chord things here, but I ended up not doing that, because here we already have to find a way to kind of transition into the B section. So I use like this really crunchy bass in the end here, end up putting a delay on it to kind of get some, I don't know, just to wrap the section up there. Yeah, and then here's a melody that I kind of wrote. This is like where this part is just chopped from this melody, and originally this was over here in the first drop, but it didn't quite make sense to immediately start with that, because it's too, I feel like it's kind of too happy and too much all at once, especially considering that if we go, oh whoops, let's not move the automation. If we go to the end here, we get this really nice sort of, which is, to me, it's almost kind of like euphoric, you know, that kind of a euphoric mood. And I felt like that was a bit much to transition from this really glitchy, freaky breakdown thing, because that's kind of dark, and, well, maybe dark is too intensive a word, but it's in that direction. And this is just straight up. It's just too happy. So having this intermediate section where there's a bit more of a bass focus kind of helps, you know, prepare us for, or ease us into this section, because after this breakdown, we expect, bass emphasis and stuff. So in order to get to this more melodic part, we just need to have this intermediate section, which is really just, the first part of the drop. Yeah, so then I just have this, you can also see that these are like the melody and the chords, and then from here, it's all just the same bass sound that's just kind of there to fill out the low end, whereas before I was really doing bass riffs. Now I'm just kind of like, the bass is only there because, it's a drop in drum and bass. Of course there's bass. And yeah, it just kind of follows the melody mostly, kind of emphasizing some notes, just adding support in nice places. Also does its own rhythmic thing sometimes to kind of add a little more interest. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And then we go to the final breakdown of the tune before we head into the outro. So here, this is another melody that I wrote originally in one of the breakdowns, and this is more heavily based on the original 7/4 melody that I started with. So the 7/4 identity of this melody is really apparent, I think, because if you listen to this on its own, we got the pitch bend bug again. Nice. I feel like the phrases kind of like line up in weird ways. Like it's not 2-bar phrases or anything. It's like sometimes like 2.5 or something weird like that. It's a bit hard. I kind of wrote it in such a way that there's not a very clear distinction between the phrases, but I think, I don't know, I kind of enjoy the way it sounds. Yeah, so here's another, like I would say like a new phrase starts right here on the 4. With that, okay, well, my pitch is probably terrible, but it sort of introduces like this new motif or variation or whatever, but you can see that the note doesn't even start there. It's just a note that's held from the previous phrase, so it kind of blurs the boundaries between phrases. And then also, a new phrase starting on the 4, that's a really strange place to start a new phrase. So that's just really the sort of 7/4 origins of this melody showing its head, rearing its ugly head. Well, yeah, and I just kind of keep going with that. And there is a bass sound here. This is a really wide Reese that I made. The reason it sounds so wide is because the stereo width extends very far down, almost to the sub, but not quite. So you can see here. That, having something wide at 100 hertz gives it this really wide impression. You could even go all the way and just say, okay, even the sub gets some stereo. Although there's not much there to begin with. But there are some great tunes I love, like some of the Tech Genesis stuff from his album Temp. Has these crazy wide basses, and when I was first listening to that, I was just breaking my head over how he got those basses so freaking wide. But then I, ended up taking the tune into Ableton and looking at them on a spectrum analyzer, and then I realized that the reason they sound so wide is because they have wide subs as well as, the rest of the spectrum. So there's always this huge debate about, your bass should be in mono, whatever, sub should be in mono, but I think there's something to be said for wide bass. It sounds really cool on headphones, and if you do it right, then you can do it in such a way that in mono or on speakers, it doesn't completely lose all of its power. And I was also just fine generally with having a not very powerful bass here, because it is the breakdown after all, so I'm not looking to go all in with the hardest, punchiest sound. I can pull back the energy level a bit, so if in mono my mix loses a bit of bass, loses a bit of low end, I'm generally going to be fine with that for the breakdown, For the main drops, I'd prefer to keep it you know, fairly mono compatible, having the subs be totally dead center. But for here, it was fine to just kind of keep the low mids as wide as they were, because it just, on headphones, it sounds really nice and it gives really nice separation as well, I think. Yeah, and then there's one final bass sound, which is, again, this bass I kind of use as a transition sometimes. And then we just end with something that's quite similar to some of the intro stuff. So there's, once again, the slower drums. It's an almond break. And then it's just the same idea of like having this melody motif with a huge delay on it and some string chords. And then at the end we have like this little, this phrase I wrote kind of specifically to lead into this last note. So we could end on, yeah, we could end on a strong note, I guess, literally. And of course, more sparkly sounds because, well, this turned out to be a really sparkly tune. Yeah, well, I ended up talking a lot about the writing of this tune, actually. I think I'm going to briefly go into some of the bass stuff, but and the drums as well. This is turning out to be a really long video. I can see the recording is already 36 minutes. Jeez. Well, anyway, I feel like for this tune, I've been very inspired by Amaryllis. So I want to give a quick shout out to her. She makes really cool music, and she's a good friend of mine. If you like this kind of stuff, you should definitely check her stuff out if you haven't already. So yeah, let's get into some of the drum sounds. I think that would be a good place to start. Yeah, so I alluded before to the fact that these kicks and snares, they're pretty powerful. So let's see what's going on under the hood with these. Well, they're resampled, so let's go to the original drums. It's just this kick sample mostly that I found, I think. So we can, oh yeah, it's like layered with a bunch of things. This is, yeah, so here we have, okay, so going into the kick sound, it's mostly this M-Hawk kick sample. It's some free sample pack that I downloaded ages ago. They're pretty tight kicks, are not entirely my taste. They also tend to be very long, which, you know, the tempo of this tune is 172, so if you have really long tails on your kicks, then that's just going to collide with other elements way, way too much. So I think I shortened this specifically so that it's like an eighth note long or something, so that's a manageable size in terms of mixing. So let's get into these layers. Yeah, so this is really mostly for the sub. And then here is a sample that I chopped out of a little drum and bass loop that I made with a contact library for drums. Also add some sub, but it also has this noisiness, this reverbness, which I feel kind of adds to the live feel of the sound. And then here's another like process kick that I use for the transient, because it's just it just has a nice transient. I feel it's quite powerful, nice and bright, and then I just fade that out real quick. So then all of that stuff together, you know, runs into a compressor. And at that point, we're pretty close, but I think the final result sounds a bit different still. We can go in here, see what we have. There was actually some stereo width in this kick, I think. I'm not sure where it came from. Might have been like this sample with a reverb. So yeah, I just made that mono, and then there is some EQ going on. I dipped out some stuff over here, because let's take a listen. Yeah, the noisiness, you know, that adds that live feel, it just ended up being too much, and it kind of ended up disappearing in the mix, so I just decided to just cut it. Sounds way cleaner. At some point, I considered having a reverb on it. I really like the way it sounds, but the tune being the way it is, you know, it's a dance floor tune. Dance floor tends to be quite busy, and this tune is no exception. So this mix is already really busy. So then, you know, to add reverb to your kick, that's just, yeah, that's not going to work out very well. So I just decided to get rid of that, because it was just adding more sound into the mix. that didn't necessarily need to be there to convey the musical message. And maybe if this mix was way sparser, way more minimal, it would have sounded cool. But yeah, it just ended up being a really busy tune with a really busy mix. So I had to cut that. So then the snare, I'm really happy with this snare. It sounds quite powerful. I think in the end, I end up using like a resampled version. Yeah. So let's go into like how exactly I made this. It's a bunch of post-processing, I think. Yeah, so like let's turn off all this post-processing to really get down to what we started with. So I started with this snare clap sample. Well, that's more like a regular snare, I guess. It has a nice acoustic sound to it. It doesn't have a lot of top-end noise, but it has a really nice tone to it that I quite like. But yeah, it's definitely lacking in the noise department, and it's also, you know, a bit weak. Drum and bass, really compressed, punchy drums, you know, so that's more like it. Way stronger transient and stuff. So then the second layer was just, if we just turn that off, just some sample. I might have cut out, no, I didn't even cut anything out. It was just something that I put a little fade on. It was a very noisy snare, which is kind of exactly what I wanted to kind of complement this thing, which is not very noisy at all. Yeah, so then I just EQ'd it, and I used a transient shaper to kind of shape the tail a bit more. So then together, that's already a bit closer to the final snare, but you know, obviously there's this whole mess of post-processing going on. So the first thing here is this rack that I made. It's called Current Value Snare Maker. I might have talked about this before. The concept is similar to the snare reverb, which I made a tutorial about. So rather than using a reverb, though, what I use is a Serum Effects with this Combs filter, because the Combs filter just always sounds crazy metallic-y. So if you listen to that, it adds this extra metallic-y texture onto your snare, which is really cool, I think. And then just like EQ some stuff out. If we turn that off, you can just really see how it adds a lot of texture. There's also this low pass here because for whatever reason the Combs filter had this crazy resonance at, I don't know, really high, and it's just annoying and it sounds awful. So I just low pass it because I figured that was the best way to deal with it. So yeah, then I have a transient separator rack. I also talked about this before, and this was just so I could separately treat the transient and the tail. So let's see, I have T or no, this is just standard EQ, I think. Yeah, so it's just a rack that separates the transient from the tail, and then there's just EQ on both of them that's slightly different. So let's go in, like on the transient, I ended up adding a bit more like, you know, low mids just to give it a bit more punch in that area. It just made sense in the mix. And then for the tail, there's this really nice resonance in the snare. You can hear it already kind of. And I just really wanted to bring that out. So with the EQ there, I really bring out that one frequency, like at 1.5K, that rings out a lot. And you can also see that I dip that general area down, but I bring that thing up. So this is like a nice EQing technique, I think, where you kind of do, usually you would do it the other way around, so it would look more like this, you know. But here I didn't want to remove a resonance, and rather I wanted to emphasize a resonance. So, you know, first you kind of add this peak to emphasize the resonance, but then what ends up happening is because there's already a strong peak there, and you make it even stronger with the EQ. So then you end up having a lot of energy in this frequency range. So it ends up being kind of too much. So then I kind of bring a little bit of a broader area down so that there's still this relative emphasis on this peak compared to the frequencies right next to it, but it doesn't become overwhelming in the range 1 to 2K. You can see if I remove 4, it just sounds like there's too much happening. There's too much energy. So yeah, that's just how I deal with that. Bit of reverb. This is hardly doing anything. yeah, it just adds the tiniest bit of space to it. Oh, this is great. Yeah, so here we have world's most amazing EQ. Yeah, you might have heard it. The snare doesn't really have a beefy fundamental, you know, like a lot of dance floor tunes have these really beefy 200 hertz snares, you know, but I didn't really have any 200 hertz to begin with. So what I initially ended up doing is just like giving it a crazy boost, and then I would just compress it really hard. And that helps, and it kind of brings out the fundamental a bit more, makes it nice and punchy. But it wasn't quite there, so I ended up doing something that's pretty unconventional, I'd say. It's not something I would usually do. And I ended up using Corpus, which is like this resonator thing, if you don't know. And that just kind of... You can hear it adds a ton of like punch to the low end. You can see frequency, or that's just a filter actually. Yeah, so you can see like I filtered it to around like, you know, 200 hertz, where it's like where all the punch is located. And yeah, that's just tuned to actually slightly, yeah, it's tuned to exactly 200 hertz actually. And that just adds a bunch of punch to the sound. And then there's one more effect rack, which is just doing some parallel processing. So it's this chain which kind of takes the high end, the noisiness basically, and just kind of compresses it to add that in. Kind of emphasizes the high end a bit more. Yeah, and then I just resampled it at some point, and I just added some slight EQ and some clipping, and that's that pretty much. So that's the kick and the snare. Let's get into what else is going on at the drop. Oh yeah, there's this drum fill. Actually, I shouted out Amaryllis before, double shout out, because this is one of her samples. I think this might actually be Amaryllis playing. Yeah, I think she recorded this and like engineered. It's pretty cool. So yeah, it's just like a nice drum fill, and I kind of faded in on the last snare there. Oh, I have this other snare still enabled. Yeah. Yeah, so that's just a cool drum fill. I really like it because it has like the super fast toms. Just adds a lot of speed, I think, and it's just a cool way to go into a drop always, to do it with a little drum fill like that. And yeah, then there's just some hi-hat loop that I made. It's just really noisy, kind of wide. And then I have some other hi-hats. These are more defined, more sharp, and they just kind of sit on every 8th note where there isn't a kick and a snare. And then it's very common to have like these shuffles between your snares. So the way you would do that is you would use these hi-hats, and then you would add like a little secondary snare. So this ghost snare, you can see it's very weak, it's very low down in the mix, but in the riff it just adds this nice shuffle. If you take it away, for example, it just doesn't have the same sense of speed. Yeah, that goes on fairly straightforward for most of the job. There's like some variations with the kick placement, obviously. Also, occasionally I move a snare around. And then here, like a nice little ride. This is always a super nice pattern to do as a transition. So it's like kind of a double kick and a snare immediately followed by like more kicks and more snare. It's just, yeah, it just sounds like this. And it's just this nice little drum fill that you can do without needing to use extra samples for toms and stuff, because you can do it with just your kick and your snare. It's just to help indicate like, hey, there's a transition happening here. We're going to do something different now, you know, which is the B section of the drop, of course, which I already talked about the writing of that. Also just like taking those shuffles and those hi-hats out to kind of just bring all the attention of the drums to this little fill thing. And yeah, then it's like pretty straightforward, more drop stuff. And then I end up taking out this hi-hat loop here for the breakdown, just to kind of dial the energy back a bit. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I already talked about how I wrote these drums in the breakdown here. And then, you know, for the second drop, it's pretty much the same thing. I ended up using the drum fill kind of in the middle here, kind of a weird place, but it made sense to me. So in context, it sounds like... pitch bend bug again. Nice. Oh, that doesn't even fix it. Wow. Yeah. There we go. For whatever reason, the pitch bend bug has really been haunting me in this project. Okay. One more shot. Let's hear it. Yeah. So it's right there. It's very subtle. I kind of dialed it back a bit. I think I also just lowered the volume on the sample here and chopped it a bit. Didn't use the entire thing, but it just made sense to kind of... because it goes into this Supersaw thing, so it's nice to add the drum fill there, I think. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the drums. There's some more stuff going on here. Yeah, let's talk about that first, actually. So some slight compression, TDR Nova to kind of bring out some of the high end, but also compress that. So you can kind of see that kind of ducks down on the snares a bit. Because I just wanted to have the drums generally sound a bit brighter. But this thing with the snare, you know, the snare is already quite bright on its own, so I didn't want to push that too far. So of course I could go into the hi-hats and into the kick and EQ all of that stuff, but this is just a nice way to kind of glue it together a bit as well. Then there's this plugin called DSEQ, which basically takes out annoying resonances. It's very similar to Soothe. I think I used it quite subtly here, like... It just slightly takes the edge off the drums, I feel. Quite so. I use it in a few other places as well, just to kind of deal with some stuff. And yeah, now there's just a simple hard clip that I use. Not even oversampled or anything, because, you know, with the drums, I feel like it doesn't really matter if you get something that sounds inharmonic, because the drums aren't very harmonic sounding to begin with. You know, they're not very tonal. So I feel like I can just get away with that. And then it's just nice to clip off these shorter peaks on the drums, because then by the time, you know, your whole tune is going to smack into a limiter, some of the peaks will already have been chopped off a slight amount. And then the EQ is doing nothing. So that's it for the drums. I'm going to talk a bit more about the sound design aspect of things. But first I'm going to take a break, because I've been recording for 52 minutes now, and I feel like I could use a break. All right, so I took a little break, refresh a little. So now it's time to talk about the sound design, and let's just go kind of in order that these sounds show up in the drop. So we start with the main melody thing. So this is actually a patch that I lifted from the original track that this is based on, and without post-processing it sounds kind of like this. It's pretty much a low-pass saw with some slight FM stuff going on. But yeah, rather than like taking out the low-pass filter to get some high-end, I actually just ended up using a bunch of distortion to get the high-end back, and also just EQing stuff up really hard. It seems a bit counterproductive, but I feel like it's, you know, by getting the high end in a different way, it just gives it a little, it gives it a unique sound, you know, because if I would just play a straight saw wave, it would sound kind of generic, you know, because everyone's heard a saw wave, and I not a particularly huge fan of that. So this thing, compression doesn't barely anything. Very subtle reverb, but the fact that it's so subtle doesn't actually matter, because we're going to distort it later, and that's just going to bring that out. It's going to blow that up like crazy. And then I use some really extreme EQ to kind of get some of my high end back a little bit. And then I just go into pedal, and pedal just always distorts things just crazy hard. It's kind of quiet right now, but that's why I use a compressor. And you can see that after all this distortion and this compressor, which isn't even compressing, but, you know, after all this distortion, you've really increased the level of the sound, so then all of that quiet reverb stuff also comes up. So now you can hear that what first was quite subtle reverb now turns into this nice metallic-y tail, and that makes the sound, I think, very intense. It's a little more reverb. I think this just uses an effect at some points. Yeah, it's like here in the beginning, kind of give this hall feeling back in the intro when things are kind of ambient still. But yeah, that's it. And then this is pretty much all of this stuff is just like mixing stuff. Changes the texture a bit, but it just kind of places it in a nice place. And then its auto pan is also a creative thing that I use in the second drop. I talked about that a bit in the writing stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much that synth. I like the intensity of it, because especially if you listen to the reverb tail, it's very metallic-y and it's very, I don't know, it's kind of an obnoxious sound, but in the context, I feel like that helps it just kind of stand out and deliver some power. Although it's not even all that powerful. But yeah, then the next thing you hear is like this immediate like splash of this thing, which is also complemented by the chimes that I talked about earlier, and also like a little white noise tail thing. But these chimes, these are just, or these, well, these chord sounds basically, they're just samples that I made in sound design sessions. So if you like look up the original sample, we can, ooh, that's quite nice. And then I just transposed it up an octave and some more to kind of make it fit the key of the song. And then from there, I just added OTT because I just really wanted to crunch this one up, brought up the high end a bunch. And then there's more processing on the group. So it's a grain delay with the pitch set to 12. So it's going to pitch up all of the grains, and it has some feedback. And pitching up with feedback on grain delay creates this crazy sparkly sound always. So if you listen to that, it's really sparkly. Whereas if you turn that off, it's losing all of that super high-end sparkliness. So it's really the grain delay that's responsible for most of the texture there, I'd say. And then it's just like some more EQ and limiter just to turn it up, I think. In here, yeah, there's a bit of a slow echo thing to kind of have things sustain just a little bit more. A ton of reverb, obviously. And yes, some compression. I'm not sure if that's doing anything. Oh yeah, it's doing a fair amount actually. The compressor is really just there to have this thing sustain quite nicely so that for most of this section you can still hear the chord sound. Oh, my phone's buzzing. So the compressor just helps sustain that. And then there's DSEQ again, which is more like a mixing sort of thing to kind of take out the extreme harshness. It's not doing much. It's particularly on this sound, which is like another sample. It's the same OTT and EQ, but I just kind of think I did this to kind of match it closer to the other sound. But you can still hear that they have like a slightly different texture, and of course they're playing different chords. So it's like a nice variation. This one's also a little bit weaker, which I feel like makes sense because then like the first thing you hear is quite powerful, but then the other chord doesn't have to be as powerful, so it's a bit more back and forth. Yeah, but also at the same time that you hear that, we get introduced to this bass sound. So let's talk about like the kind of mindset that I have for creating that. For this tune, it was really a lot of like, I hear a sound in my head and I just try to make it. And this is pretty much a simple FM womp that I had in the beginning here. So if you listen to this, this intro or this breakdown sort of riff before the drop, it's just a quite subtle sort of womp thing, and I think I just literally copied that patch, and I wanted to make it more intense for the drop. So just if we turn off all this stuff, it's pretty much the same thing. It's very similar, although it adds one more operator, I think, to kind of change the texture a little bit, and then it's just compressor helps make it more intense because you can see like it has these envelopes, so to flatten that out a bit, a little compression goes a long way. And then crazy amount of saturation, although dialed back with a dry wet to preserve the bass a bit, because I find that often if you distort things really hard, you kind of end up losing some of your fundamental frequency. And of course, I don't want to lose the sub in my bass sound. You know, I could, you know, go in and layer everything with separate subs, but for whatever reason, I just prefer doing it this way. I'm not saying it's better. Might even be worse, who knows? But that's just the way I do things, and it makes sense for me. Makes sense in my brain. So yeah, I just dial back the dry wet to preserve my sub a bit more. But still have that distorted sound, still have that nice crunchy top end and mid range. Yeah, let's see, some band splitting going on with, this is probably a chorus, or yeah, it's like a stereo effect that I put on the high end. Yeah, just to give some stereo width to your bass. It's a nice thing to do. So here I take out some of the low mids, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to distort after. Not quite, I first add a reverb, but then I do distort. And I do it really hard, actually. So here's two interesting things that go on. Like, you can just distort a sound, just crank it up. But I find that oftentimes in bass sounds, when I'm working on them, I need to take out some of the frequencies here. I just need to dip those down and sometimes even boost the sub. And then when I do that, I can distort it harder without it sounding totally overblown and out of proportion crazy. Because oftentimes if you push it really hard, you get these really overblown low mids, but by EQing them out before you go into the distortion, it just, I don't know, it just works better. It just doesn't create these overblown low mids, and it just works better. But also you can see that I did dial in the dry wet a bit to preserve my sub, and then also reverb before distortion, like small reverbs. It's kind of the same principle as this sound here, this melody sound. By adding a little reverb before distortion, I can really bring that out as a tail sort of sound. So you can hear it's this huge kind of thing coming right after it, although I do end up gating that out, I think. Some EQ, kind of shaping it a bit, and then there's Redux doing some bit crushing, and this really added a lot of texture, because at this point I wasn't quite satisfied with the amount of crunch I had in my sound, and I decided on a whim to use a bit crusher. Usually bit crushers have this very obvious sound, but for this it actually ended up blending in quite nicely with the distortion, I feel. Like, if you listen to it like this, you can quite obviously hear that it's bit crushed, but I feel like in the mix there's lots of other stuff going on at a high end as well, so it kind of masks that a bit, so it adds some more crunch, but it's also not super obvious bit crushing. Yeah, and then there's just some more EQ, compression, gating, because the tail was kind of too much for me. I just brought it down by 10 dB, it seems. And this utility is not doing much. Yeah, so the next sound is this really high bass, and this was another one where, you know, hear it in your head and kind of try to make it. So yeah, in my head, this is pretty close to what I heard in my head, I think. It's just this bass sound with this really piercing high note in it as well. So that's kind of what I started with, is this main thing here. And you can see it's like two layers, one sub and one like higher layer. So if you solo the higher layer, it's pretty much just a high note with some FM and some noise, I think. The noise is coming from the erosion, yeah. And then the sub is just, well, it's just a sine wave with some harmonics, and that's it pretty much. And then those two sounds together, they go into this processing chain. So there's like a high passed chorus and more saturation, some EQ as well. Yeah, it's also just taking out the stereo from the low end. And here you can see again where I like boost the low end before going into the distortion to add some crunch. So if you just listen to that, that has a fair amount of crunch. There's also this auto pen, of course, coming in to create the wobble. I think most of this is like mixing stuff after here. Yeah, and then I use the bit crushing again as a creative effect, like right there. But other than that, you can ignore most of this. At some point during mixing, I think I felt like there were some low mids missing from this sound. And it can be quite difficult to kind of get that in with, adding more distortion or whatever, doing stuff like that. But the cool thing about making electronic music is that you use a lot of synths and you just get the flexibility to just, add things on top. Like when you mix your own stuff, you get this huge flexibility to just add another synth layer. So that's exactly what I did. So that way you can very clinically, very precisely add some harmonics where you feel like they're missing, without having to fiddle around with distortion and stuff. And I really I really feel bad for mixing engineers who have to like work with recorded instruments, because then you just, every instrument has been recorded and that's just what you get. You cannot change the recording. But as an electronic artist, you get this huge flexibility to just go back and say like, okay, well, I'm just going to add another layer because I need more low mids, and doing more distortion and stuff that would just complicate things a bunch. So it's just a really clinical way to do things, and that's a huge luxury that you have as an electronic music producer, I feel. It's quite subtle, I think. Yeah, I hardly hear it actually. Yeah, maybe I dialed it back too far, or maybe I ended up not really needing it all that much. But either way, it does illustrate the point that you do have this huge flexibility. This also, I've seen some of Matthews's live streams, and he talks about it in some of those, in the studio videos or whatever they're called. And that's a thing that, from what I can understand from Matthews's workflow, is he really does a lot of mixing by just going straight to the source, by going into the synth and doing something there, rather than trying to fix it with EQ, compression, distortion, what have you. And I mean, in a way, that does seem like a really good way to do it. Just get it right at the start. And then all of the mixing stuff he does is fairly subtle EQ and compression, I think. Just to slightly place things more. And, the guy just like crazy layered basses, like, lots of layers for one bass. But yeah, that's just enough of a tangent about the flexibility of being an electronic music producer. Let's see what's next. Yeah, so then there's this two things happening. There's this extra bass sound. It's pretty straightforward. Some movement in the sound. It's interesting. I'm not sure where that comes from. Kind of sounds like a Reese, but not quite. It might be some chorusing or something. Where is it? Yeah, it's from the sine thing. Huh. It's funny how that creates movement. I didn't really know that. Yeah, it's just making a sound and using EQ to further hone in on placing it in a certain place. This is more subtle stuff. But yeah, this bass kind of complements this melody as well. This melody, in the riff, it kind of functions as something kind of a back and forth with the main melody. You can see that I made this MIDI effect rack that just kind of doubles everything as an octave. So rather than going in just manually doing that, you can just do it with an effect rack like that. And it's a fairly straightforward synth sound. So let's just turn off all of this post-processing and see what it sounds like. Let's go even further and just turn off the post-processing in Serum as well. I'm not using the chorus. It's a very simple sound to start with, But one thing for this kind of music, I feel like with electronic music, you can kind of go one of two ways. You can go very subtle and really try to make simple sounds, but that are super carefully crafted and work really well in their place. Or you can go another way where you really sort of make a synth sound that has like a certain idea to it, and then you really push that idea really far. And I feel like for drum and bass and for like a lot of like neuro-oriented stuff, it's about pushing these ideas very far. It's about making crazy modulated sounds and stuff and really intense sounding stuff. So here's a fairly simple synth patch, and I use some distortion. and you hardly even hear it. But then when I turn on the EQ, a lot of those harmonics get brought out a lot. You can see it just has this more kind of just tube distortion sound to it. And I wanted to bring that out even further. So that's when I really start to kind of go ham with the post-processing and say like, okay, that's some pretty severe compression as well, like with soft clipping as well, to really bring that out and make it way louder, way more intense. Dip down some of the stuff over here because it was a little too intense. Yeah, some stereo processing as well to kind of, I think this was mostly a mixing decision, and then, yeah, bringing out even more of the top end and just dipping down some stuff here dynamically because it was also too much. And there's a mid side rec. Let's see what I did. I wanted a little more stereo width, and for whatever reason, I decided to keep the sides as they were, but widen the mids. Bit of a strange decision, but it probably made sense at the time. And again, DSEQ makes another appearance, because I just downloaded DSEQ at this point, and I just started putting it on everywhere. That's quite a nice plugin. Yeah, that comes a big one. This is like my favorite sound that I've made in a while. It's a really nice Reese, and I love the simplicity about this because there is some post-processing, but it's all very subtle. If I take this off, it sounds still pretty much the same. So let's actually dive in here and see what I did. Some standard like effects, but yeah, I just got this simple wavetable and I did some FM on it, and I did some stuff here. I used the unison to kind of make it into a Reese, but an important thing to do there is to say set the stereo to 0. Here I actually set it slightly higher than 0 because it can help just create stereo width, but be wary that it does also create stereo in the sub. So I think I filtered that out somewhere later down the line. But yeah, just like this very slight stereo, but you definitely don't want to have it like sitting over here, because then it's going to be totally independent for the left and the right channels, and it's not actually going to oscillate nicely. You know, if I do this, if you're on headphones, that probably sounds really cool. And if you're listening on mono or with a subwoofer, with a single subwoofer, so the sub is in mono, then it also probably works. But it's not quite centered. It's just more powerful when it's centered like this. Yeah, it's just a simple wavetable with some weird stretching mode or whatever, and some FM. And then let's see, all of that stuff goes into filter 1, so it gets low passed a bit. Then there's noise I add, which bypasses the filters. It goes straight to the effects. But the stuff that comes out of filter 1, you know, this basically the main tone of the Reese, goes into filter 2. And you can see this is a phaser, but this is not just a phaser. This is a phaser that's being modulated at audio rate. So this is something I love about Vital. One thing you can do is you can just take an LFO and you can say, okay, hey LFO, you're going to oscillate at the same speed as these oscillators, and that's by selecting this key track thing, and then you can like basically select a pitch. You can basically retune it in the same way that you would tune these oscillators. So you can see that that's just playing a saw wave, and that's modulating the phaser. So you get this really crazy effect when phasers start to move at audio rate, and that I feel like that adds a lot of the texture. If we just take off these effects for a second. There's a sliminess to the sound. If I turn this off, it sounds more straightforward, I feel. It loses that slimy texture when you take it off. There's still something there in the top end that sounds a bit slimy, but it's not quite. I feel doing this just, I don't know, I've got some really nice results out of it. And yeah, that's what I love about the sound, is like how deceptively simple it is. From there, it's really just some quite harsh distortion that got kind of overblown, so I had to take out some of the low mids again, and oh, do not forget to turn on the noise again. Oh yeah, that's actually kind of crucial. Adding the noise with the distortion. Yeah, you get this nice oscillation from the Reese, of course, and then when the two, when these two voices are like lined up with each other phase-wise, then they're gonna amplify each other, right? So they're gonna push into the distortion really hard, and as a result, all of the noise basically gets clipped off, so you hardly hear it. But then, as these two drift out of phase, eventually they will cancel out, and you will get this sort of, they will cancel out, so that kind of gives some room for the noise to shine through. And you can hear that as well when you listen to the noise component of this sound. It kind of occurs within these oscillations, and it just sounds really cool. And there's like tons of bass sounds like this in drum and bass, and I feel it's in that sense a really standard, straightforward Reese, but I'm really particularly happy with the execution of this sound. Like everything just lined up and it worked out quite nicely. Yeah, just some EQ to just fix some excessive low mids and high end, and then some simple reverb. It's quite subtle, but it just adds some space. Yeah, EQ, indeed cutting out the sides on the low end and boosting some of the high end, because apparently that wasn't exactly up to speed. It's also quite nice to kind of have the tops be really wide. A lot of people talk about, mixing like an inverse triangle, so bass is mono, and the further up you go in the frequency spectrum, the wider things get, or the wider your mix gets in general. So this is kind of like that principle, I suppose. And yeah, then there's like some compression, but it's not even doing anything. I wonder why that's there. This reverb is like an effect reverb, so that's also most of the time not doing anything. And then there's like a slight EQ bump, which is really just to mix it and to make the sub as loud as the rest of the subs in the tune. Because that's an important thing, is like having all the subs in your sounds be sort of equal loudness, I feel. So the way that I check that is I always like use a spectrum, I think, and then I set it up kind of like this, and then I kind of set up a reference level. You can see some of these higher peaks are a little bit lower, but I think that's fine to generally have sort of a curve like that. Because like, if you have a sub that moves up to a really high note, then having it be, it often gets too powerful, because on those higher frequencies, your ears are more sensitive, so you just perceive it to be louder. So it makes sense to objectively have it be quieter, so that subjectively it sounds equal loudness, basically. Yeah, slight soft clipping, and this utility is just turning it down, because apparently I couldn't do that in the mixer. Yeah. And yeah, I think at that point we've covered all of the sounds. There's like one more here in this section. It's this really nice bass sound that I made. Sounds like this. Oh, let's try to find the original. I really like it. It's one of my favorite sounds that I made, and here I just reversed it and kind of layered it with this. I think you'll hardly hear this, but it's just some extra texture in there, I guess. Yeah, and that kind of, I use that bass as sort of a transition into the B section. So in the B section, this Reese kind of becomes the focal point. I've also added like this little synth, not really too crazy. It's this plinky arpeggio to kind of add some drive. I've already talked about that, I think. And the sound design on that isn't really super interesting. So yeah, then we have this bass sound getting more attention, and then we get some new sounds here, some bass stabs. These are actually, I think these might be the ones I made in the bass stabs tutorial. These were the ones that either I made or I showed off as an example, I'm not sure. But yeah, then I processed these some more, so they weren't quite punching enough for my taste, so like, you know, so first thing I did is I just did some mid-side EQing, and then I saturated them quite hard. And you can see that I've dialed the dry wet way back, and this just gives that nice, really heavily distorted sound while still remain the clarity of the unprocessed sample. And then this distortion, I wanted to bring that out more, so I just used an EQ for that. And then finally there's like some extra distortion just to kind of, I think it's mostly to keep the levels under control and to add just a bit more crunch, I think. And then this is just like a, yeah, a little fade in thing. And then here we get this nice thing that happens right after. I wanted to emphasize the arpeggios there because I thought that would be, I don't know, it just made sense. I wanted to write a riff like that. So I used this secondary synth melody to kind of layer onto those arpeggios. And then I also made this bass sound, which is quite intense, I feel. Bunch of reverb at the end there. So this is again an operator. Let's see what we have here. Close all that stuff down. 2 layers. That's quite a funky layer. It kind of sounds like one of those 7 or like 90s video game bass guitar synth kind of sound. So that just kind of ends up fading in, and then here's a that's just a straight up sub. And then, so basically what happens is like this sub goes into this crazy processing chain, right? With like some noise being added and some bit crushing and just a bunch of saturation and stuff. Fairly straightforward. But then over time, this second layer fades in. So you can see if we grab the automation here, like it starts fading in like this, and that, by injecting that into the processing chain as well, you get, it just starts to interact and changes the texture drastically. So that's a really, it's also one of my favorite sounds, I feel. Same idea here, where I just wanted to emphasize this melody with the bass, although I don't end up fading in a layer, just yeah, it's the same womp we had already. It's all familiar bass sounds from here. So let's see about the next time we have a new bass sound. Yeah, for the breakdown here, it's like a nice Reese. This is just a bass on a preset that I made earlier. It's a fairly neutral sounding Reese, kind of a standard neuro Reese, I feel. It's a fairly minimal preset, so it's very nice to use as a starting point for sound design, I feel. I did end up adding a phaser to it in the preset, which wasn't originally there. But yeah, from there, just adding post-processing to really bring out aspects of the sound that I really like. I think pedal is doing most of the heavy lifting here. I especially like it on the fuzz mode. It just adds this amazingly crunchy top-end texture. Yeah, so it's fairly straightforward in that sense. Yeah, let's see. I've already talked a bit about these glitches, and that isn't really sound design. It was mostly just resampled stuff. At that point, there is not much left to talk about other than maybe this Supersaw, but, well, that's fairly straightforward, I think. A bunch of saw waves. Big reverb. I end up changing the reverb time there to kind of make that last note really ring out a bunch. Yeah, that's all fairly straightforward. I've also talked about this wide Reese already, but to quickly reiterate, It sounds really wide because the stereo, because it's even in the low mids, it's still very wide. The only thing that's mono about it is the sub, pretty much. Yeah, it's just a simple Reese. Let's see. There's a couple more things here to talk about. Yeah, this is interesting to talk about. For the intro, I just used some strings, you know, with grain delay. It's kind of how it starts. And then I start fading in this soundscape. So one thing I really like doing is just making soundscapes. So we can just go to the sample and just a soundscape that I made. And it's really nice to chuck in for like intros or breakdowns and stuff. So here I end up repitching it slightly, EQing it, and also you could hear that that soundscape has like a bunch of sub. And I didn't want it to be just straight up sub because that just felt like too much. So I end up using an auto pan to kind of give a wobble to the sub. So it's like slowly pulsing along. And yeah, that's something I really like. Other than that, some vocals. Ton of reverb. Fairly standard vocal chops. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I think. I don't really have much else to talk about. Wow, I think I now have about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 25 minutes worth of footage or something. I did not expect this this to take so long, but yeah, I think I I really exhaustively talked about everything that I wanted to talk about for this track. So I really hope you enjoyed it and you feel like you got something out of it. This is the first time I'm doing a video like this, so if you like it, let me know in the comments. Also, fairly standard stuff, you know, subscribe, join my Discord server, follow me on Twitter because I post dumb jokes there sometimes that are really not funny. Yeah, cheers, thanks for watching.